It was a dramatic end to the Monaco Grand Prix as rain started to fall, which made the whole event more exciting to watch. The drivers were all pushed to their limit in a race that almost hit the maximum time in the Principality. There's a lot to take from this race, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Monaco Grand Prix. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. The right call at the right time. This season, we are desperate for some kind of championship fight. This weekend in Monaco, we could have had a fight between Alonso and Verstappen, but in the end, it was the Red Bull team and Max Verstappen who made the right call at the right time, and as a result, won this race comfortably this weekend. Verstappen had the tyre advantage off the line as he went with the medium compound, but through the first stint, he was forced into doing an excellent job of managing the graining. This tyre management was not easy for the Dutchman as he was suffering with this degradation from an early stage. Despite the graining, the Red Bull team recognised the value of track position at this race. As long as he wouldn't end up with a puncher, he would also be able to keep the other cars behind, as he had a decent lead. The rain looming was also giving him a headache, as he was on tyres that would not be able to build good temperature through the rest of the lap, given the graining, which made his job even more difficult. But he got onto intermediate tyres at the right time, and this gave him a significant advantage, especially with Alonso making an error through the pit stops. Once he was on the intermediates, Verstappen looked at ease. He was building the gap to Alonso behind and had a pit stop advantage over his closest rival. And to be honest, he was brilliant this weekend. He managed to get the pole position with an awesome lap, and he was consistently out on track early to avoid any challenges from yellow or red flags. This shows signs that he's learnt lesson from years of the past, and he's comfortably at ease when leading a Grand Prix. It was a brilliant race and a great way to build his championship lead, so it's got to be a green box for Verstappen for his Monaco race. A daring lap 1 pit stop for Sergio Perez. It was a dreadful Saturday for Sergio Perez. Despite usually being incredibly consistent on street circuits and having the fastest car this season, he made an error in Q1. Coming into Saint-Devote, he lost the rear end, hitting the barrier with his rear left tyre and leaving him out of qualifying. This was a classic example of a driver pushing too much into turn 1 when they absolutely didn't need to. In the Red Bull, getting through to Q3 should be a formality, and Perez knows this. But instead of ensuring he got himself into Q2 with a solid banker lap, he went all out and ended up last and out of contention. Of all the circuits on the 2023 calendar, Monaco is the worst place for this to happen. Grid position is critical to have a successful race at this track, and so starting in 20th was always going to be a difficult place to be if you wanted to score more points. To give himself the best chance, Red Bull opted for a daring strategy. Perez started on the medium compound, which implied that he was planning a short first stint, and that's exactly what happened as he stopped at the end of the first lap in order to give himself clean air to run in over the first few laps. This strategy was quite bold, and he'd have lost out if there had been a safety car before he could catch up with the rest of the pack. In reality, Perez was fortunate that he had a quick stop from the team, ensuring he was able to get out of the pits ahead of both Guan Yu Zhou and Nico Hülkenberg, as those runners were also forced into the pits following first lap incidents. Had Perez come out behind these two drivers, he may have had a difficult time overtaking them, given they would all be on fresh tyres. But instead, the Mexican driver was able to make significant progress in catching back up with the main pack. This was a great result for the driver as he made his way up to most of the runners ahead of them, but it was still a strategy that would need a bit of luck to make work. In the end, the fact that the rest of the runners would pit even later in the race, and Perez was involved in some incidents with some other cars, including the likes of Lance Stroll and Kevin Magnussen, it meant it didn't pay off. The latter incident forced Perez into another unplanned stop and realistically took the Red Bull driver out of any chance of catching up with the runners in the points-paying positions. On the whole, it was a poor weekend for Perez. The fact that he's fallen a further 25 points behind the championship leader in Verstappen is disappointing. But realistically, his weekend was over when he hit the barrier in turn 1 on Saturday. So for me, it's got to be a red box for Perez. His weekend was disappointing and his street circuit reputation seems to have eluded him in Monaco. Wet weather chaos. It was a dramatic closing stage in the Monaco race this weekend as the wet weather started to fall in turn 3 on lap 50. This was a brilliant change up for the weekend as the drivers were all on the wrong tyres, and because it started in sector 2, there was a way to make the slick tyres work. But it was dramatic to see the cars all struggle through that sector and have to tiptoe their way around those corners in order to avoid the barriers and the other cars around them. As the rain continued to fall, there was more and more errors from the drivers. We saw strategy errors from the likes of Fernando Alonso as he initially stopped for a fresh set of dry tyres and then had to stop for intermediates just 1 or 2 laps later. This was unfortunate for the Spaniard, but he was in a position where he was in need of new tyres given his hard tyres were quite old, but his teammate was testing the intermediates and wasn't able to get any kind of reasonable pace. But it was at this moment that it had all changed. The rain had got worse, and while he could have won the race by stopping at the right moment for intermediates, instead he was way behind in second position. Kevin Magnussen was trying a different strategy entirely. He decided to stay on the dry tyres for as long as possible and then move on to the full wets, but he was in a dreadful position by that point, hitting the barrier at the final turn before he could even get into the pits. This was then followed up with a trip into the runoff area in turn 1, as his wet weather tyres were simply not the right ones to give him grip in the braking zone. It was a moment where Haas and Magnussen were trying anything differential on the off chance that it would pay off and that they could score some points. Other drivers got onto the intermediate tyres at the right time, and they were forced to be concentrating massively to hit the braking zones and get every corner right. In addition, the ability to get past other drivers increased as the cars had a longer time in the braking zones, which meant there was more of a differential between the drivers. The rain gave this whole race a breath of fresh air, as it changed the game for the drivers. It created a level of drama which this race absolutely needed, and despite the fact that Verstappen was comfortably out ahead, it did make the rest of the order interesting to predict in the moment. So it was a green box for the wet weather conditions late on in this race. A high tyre degradation weekend. The tyre provider for Formula 1 has been criticised for not offering tyres that would wear too easily, and ones that would rarely encourage the teams to consider a two-stop strategy. In Monaco, the value of track position is so high that the drivers are always pushing for a one-stop race, and making the call at the right time is crucial for the teams. This race in the past has often seen the teams go for the softest compounds of tyre and then being able to run them for a long time. This weekend though, the tyre wear was significant at Monaco. The teams all started the race on either the hard or the medium compound tyres, and the medium tyres were showing signs of wear after 20 laps or so, with significant graining on the tyres on the left-hand side of the cars. This was highly unusual, but it meant that there was a big difference in the starting tyres that the teams went for, and the medium runners were in need of a pit stop when there was a risk of rain, and a risk that they could lose their track position. In return for this challenging strategy, these drivers benefited from having the faster tyre off the line though. The rain in the distance was a factor. It seemed like some of the drivers were running longer than they would have wanted to otherwise, as they were all waiting for the rain that did arrive in the end. This was something that added some interesting strategy options for the race, and when you consider how this race is usually run, these elements were all great to see, and the fact that Pirelli has given the teams more of a headache at Monaco than they had in Azerbaijan shows a sign that they're making some better decisions when it comes to the compounds they select for each race weekend. The rain which fell from lap 50 was fascinating to watch. The drivers on newer tyres had a distinct advantage as they would be able to hold more temperature in the tyre and build that temperature through the rest of the dry lap while going very carefully through the wet part of the circuit. But on the whole, even before the rain, the fact that the medium tyres were graining so quickly into the race was a good thing in my opinion, and therefore I think Pirelli deserve a green box for their decisions this weekend. This race is one of their most difficult ones each year, and they seem to have got it right this season. An awesome weekend for Alpine and Ocon. Monaco often gives an unexpected podium finish, and this year it was the turn of Esteban Ocon who became the first driver from outside the top 4 teams to take a podium finish in 2023. It was an awesome race for Ocon as he didn't put a foot wrong. He went out and put his Alpine in 3rd position on the grid, which is a brilliant achievement considering how far back the team has been in recent races. The French driver has had a good season so far, and he and his new teammate in Pierre Gasly have both been performing quite well this year. The Alpine team is clearly the 5th fastest setup on the grid this season, and given how competitive the 4 teams at the front have been this year, there needed to be a chaotic race with many errors to give a team like Alpine the chance to get on the podium this year. But even with chaotic races, there still needs to be a driver that takes advantage of the opportunity, and Ocon's performance on Saturday was just what the team needed. Despite the conditions, the French driver didn't put a foot wrong this weekend, and he did excellently to hold on to 3rd position. The Alpine team are now starting to build a bit of a gap to McLaren behind them in the constructors' standings, and results like this are brilliant to give them an even bigger gap. So it's got to be a green box for Esteban Ocon and Alpine this weekend. Honourable mentions. There's a few honourable mentions today, the first of which has to go to Fernando Alonso, as he's come second this weekend with Aston Martin. It's another step up on the podium and could have been a fight for the win had he been a bit faster in qualifying. Another honourable mention needs to go to Mercedes. The team have brought a new car to this race and it wasn't an easy environment to test their new developments, but despite this, they took 4th and 5th in the end, which is a pretty good result. At the same time, McLaren also took a double points finish and seemed to have brilliant race pace in the wet conditions. So there we have it, one of the most dramatic races of the season so far. It'll be interesting to see what happens next in Spain.